G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and that you've had a fantastic weekend as well. Now I know a lot of people are heading back to work tomorrow for their first day of the year, so look, I hope it is enjoyable and you get through it. I also have a very big day tomorrow. Of course, I start my second round of chemotherapy. Now I know I bounced through that first round. I was only off for a couple of days, but that was a much lower dose and of course the first round. So my body wasn't completely saturated with the chemical as will become over the next coming months. So look, give me some time if I have to have some time off, as well as if the videos do suffer in maybe length or quality, I will do the best job that I can on the day. But we will see how we go. Of course, there is some concern here because it is my full-time job doing this. Now, a lot of you will have seen that stupidly yesterday I cut open my finger opening up this knife. I don't know if this is good or bad luck or whatever, but I'm going to treat it as bad luck. I've carried this for a lot of time and haven't cut myself on it, and I'm definitely not a Gurkha who has to draw blood before putting a blade back in. So look, I thought someone might get a good bargain, and I've chucked it up on eBay starting at 99 cents. I believe it's about $10 at the moment, so hopefully someone gets a bargain. And if you take the DNA off it, well, I guess you could maybe clone your own willy for bloody at-home use. So have a look at that. But legends, of course, as always, we've got a lot to go over. So look, we're going to talk about Pokrovsk at length and look at what is occurring there, and now that the Russian forces have moved closer, what weapon systems they may be able to bring into the fold for that fight. We need to look at the maps. We'll compare the maps as we always do, and I want to look at some of the levels of destruction which may give us an idea about both resistance and speed of advancement. And then we need to go over this New York Times interview with Secretary of State Antony Blinken and what has just been said in this, as I think this is just very telling for the situation that we are in. And I will say, and I use this word purposefully, just the delusion with this and how people are seeing the Biden administration and how people see America's involvement around the world. And I think this interview, this tells us everything that we need to know about why Americans overwhelmingly booted this administration out of office, trying to argue that America is in a better position right now, globally and domestically, than it was 4 years ago, and also saying outwardly that the Afghanistan withdrawal strengthened the US position in international politics, which I just can't agree with on any basis of any of that. And we'll also be talking about the how he sees Israel, Gaza, what is being said in this, in what we know that the US position, and at least the US political's position in this, is not what the vast majority internationally actually see to. And the UN voting tells us this. And we'll talk about then the negative aspects in the informational space that this has had to do with when, say, Russia targets somewhere in a city, and you'll see people pop up and go, well, look at what you are not condemning on this side and the hypocrisy there. Now, I know a lot of nuance needs to be added, and we'll add that as we go. But look, let's start on the maps, and we'll talk about Pokrovsk. So, of course, here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. Now, the red area occupies since 22, the purple since 2014, and any red check on this is ground that Deep State Map is saying that Russia is occupying over the past 24 hours. So we'll come down Donetsk Oblast, of course, Pokrovsk. Now, no changes shown on this map today, but we will show you some changes, and we'll talk about this area at length. So look, let's start with the maps while we're sitting here, and we will just zoom this one across so get you a better idea. So situation Pokrovsk front, Russian army took full control over this town. Now the labeling is a bit poor, but if we zoom in, we can see this town here, Surak is saying has come under complete occupation, as we see on the west of this map, but then further pushes out as well towards Kotliny, which of course is both the rail and the main road coming through, which are two of the main sectors to bring logistics into Pokrovsk. Of course, there are some other major both roads and rail, but it will soon cut off another one. As you can see, some more movements around this Zeleny Lysivkia area as we see on this, but no massive changes, and we don't expect to see a lot of changes because of what we presume are a lot of the fortifications sitting around Pokrovsk, Minograd, for just how important this area is. But we have said that before and have eaten our words. Something I showed you previously and I want to show you again is now that that border has been moving closer and closer, what we are starting to see and what is going to become a big problem is the use of fiber optic controlled FPV drones. And you can see Pokrovsk here. Now, while we're watching this, just take note for the amount of destruction here just for a bit further on in this video. And what we can see is this fiber optically controlled drone moving then around Pokrovsk, spots a Ukrainian Armed Forces vehicle here. Then if we just skip forward on the footage a little bit, we can see as we come in, these guys then getting out of this vehicle. But what I'm interested in is as we come in a little bit closer, we can see why these fiber optic drones are so deadly. This vehicle on top is carrying some sort of electronic warfare equipment. Now, this is where these drones excel. These have no effect, or electronic warfare has no effect on these drones. So they can go in, they can take out that EW, and then your other systems, your other drones can then work with impunity, then moving up. These are a very, very deadly system. But what a lot of people have seen is as the front line has moved closer, weapons like those drones are coming into range. And we have seen this, but something else that is coming into range is Russia's D30 howitzers. Of course, a very old artillery system, but these are cheap and the amount of them and for the ammo is absolutely massive. So max range of about 15.4 kilometers, around 10 miles. Now, you don't want to be firing artillery again and again and again at absolute max range. It wears out the barrels very quickly. This is something we saw happen for the Russian forces in Bakhmut. You also can't have artillery pieces right on the front line either. They can be right near there, but you don't want them on the absolute zero line. So 15 kilometers, let's work with this. How far is the front line from, say, in here of Pokrovsk? We're talking about 6K. So if we were to come out to 15, these D30s, which of course they have much more numbers of, are much cheaper to use, the 122mm, than other systems, we'll see these brought more and more into the fold on Pokrovsk as there is further assaults. And we are seeing from videos like this, and I can't remember if this audio will come in or not. If it doesn't, I'll chuck it in the edit. It might just not line up with my voice, but an absolute massive amount of shelling coming into Pokrovsk itself, and of course the introduction of those drones also. Now, what I think we will see next, there's a few things we have seen, and I say the Russians are assaulting somewhat paint by numbers on areas at the moment, and why they're continuing to do this, because it continues to work. What they do is they hit with fabs, these 250, 500, 3,000 kilogram fabs, long range, talking 40 to 60 kilometers, depending on variants, to soften up areas. Then they are capturing the flanks, then they smash with artillery, then they have further reconnaissance patrols, either on electronic scooters or then motorcycles. But one of the things we see is those fabs, and then once the forces get closer and closer, we'll see artillery and TS1, of course, thermobaric multiple launch rocket systems, brought into the fold. And that is what I think we will see on Pokrovsk soon. So we talked about that range to bring in the D30. So Russia may be able to bring numerical fire massively compared to other more expensive systems in your 150mm range, and even sometimes in your 200mm range, as that has come in for the D30. But I believe very soon we will start seeing Russia soften up then Pokrovsk with TOS. Why not until now? Well, the biggest problem with TS1 Alpha, which we mostly speak of, is the range. The original range of this is only 2,700 meters. It is not far at all. That is 1.5 miles. Now, there are some other variants. Some have extended out to 6 kilometers. And then the newest ones, you're talking about 10 kilometers, and your TOS 3, you're talking around 15 Ks. But the thing is with this is these are so susceptible to drones. If you're talking 3 to 6 kilometers, well, Ukrainian drones will spot that and will take it out. And we've seen large losses of this. And of course, they need to be brought much, much closer to the front line, much, much more dangerous. But those are, of course, a fantastic system at just wreaking havoc amongst fortified positions due to the way that thermobaric warheads work. So I think it is highly likely very soon we will see then those weapon systems brought into the fold on Pokrovsk. And we do know that those systems are absolutely devastating. But as that closes in, I think we'll more likely see that coming more and more. Now, we'll have a look around Kurakhove, Shevchenko. You can see some ground being made, occupying more of Shevchenko, more to the west of Kurakhove. And of course, this pocket is starting to close up. Now, I think we will see a large withdrawal out of here just due to being able to actually defend in here. I know there's fortified lines. The problem is the fortified lines in here are to protect from a south to north attack. Russia is coming then east to west, greatly reducing the efficiency of those attacks. It's exactly what Ukraine tried to do down around Tokmak, was push through and then make a swing attack and go on the flank of these fortified positions. But we talk Shevchenko in here, and there's a bit of misleading information. Now, one thing we do know in Ukraine is there are multiple areas with the same name. So we've got Shevchenko here, we've got Shevchenko here, and then we also have another Shevchenko just to the northwest of Velika Novosilka right here. Now, this is where there has been, and I don't believe anyone's doing this maliciously, but there has been some misinformation about a mine in this area. And there's been some blatant misinformation about that, but I'm sure you can all see through this. So AMK Mapping shared this. I'm seeing a lot of people saying that Russia has captured the largest Ukrainian lithium deposit in Shevchenko, northwest of Velika Novosilka. This is not true. It's still around 7 kilometers from the front line in Western Donetsk Oblast. I assume people are saying this because there are 2 other villages called Shevchenko, which are recently captured, as I showed you on the map. Please check your maps before making such statements. So this is the Shevchenko that we are talking about that I just showed you, and measuring around and about 9.5 kilometers on a rough then distance calculation there. Additionally, lithium wasn't even mined in Ukraine in the first place, meaning that the proper infrastructure to mine it isn't present. However, as it isn't extracted from brine, but rather from rock, the solar evaporation process, which can take up to a year, can be skipped when mining. It also means that the large expanses of terrain required, say above here, where you've got these evaporation ponds here, and you can see the discoloring, that's why Teslas are so great for the environment, that this isn't then required to evaporate the different types of salts, sulfates, as well as magnesium, that you don't need to then do this. This does make the establishment of the required infrastructure to extract lithium in the future much easier once the deposits are eventually captured and are far enough behind the front line, although obviously not as easy as if Russia just captured a pre-built infrastructure and fixed any damage to them fighting, unless of course Ukraine chose to blow it up before retreating, which we can see as well, and we have seen before with things like bridges and some other infrastructure. So no, there's a little bit of misinformation coming out about which Shevchenko and the infrastructure that is also sitting there. So it's just worth noting on that. But what we do know is there are billions into the trillions of dollars worth of resources currently that Russia occupy that are incredibly relevant into the coming world for then resource dependence. People don't want Russia to have it. Russia want it. And of course, this is where this war fights on and fights on. So there's a few areas here I want to talk about. So while we're in Velika, we'll talk about this. Suryak does show this, so we'll just come down a little bit more. Does show there is further Russian advancement just in around where my cursor is at the moment, that the Russian army made new advances northwest of Rivnepil. So, sorry, it's just a bit off here. We have Rivnepil, and just in this area, I think he meant northeast. My reading is way off. Blame the tumour. So just in this sector, as we showed you before, and as we move up the map, you'll see then to the east of Pokrovsk Minigrad, from the Osharetne front, you can see further Russian gains here as well. Remember, Suryak shows that this is basically cut off down here, but there is a creation of this pocket at the moment. I'd say wait out on this front, as this could easily form the eastern flank of not only Pokrovsk Minigrad, but a further pocket that could develop all the way from Chasiv Yar all the way through for Torets Konstantinivka, with Russia's eventual goal being in here, of course, Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. But as we move up the map more, there's a very important area we have been talking about, of course, in here, Terney Ivanivka. Now, this map isn't showing it, although they show grey zone across at Ivanivka, and you can see today this grey zone expanding. Now, the first map to show that the Russian forces had actually got around this area was actually Noel reports that I had seen, of course, a Ukrainian source. And Syriac has caught up on this. So if we come in, zoom in, this is Ivanivkia, Terny, this red dot is Terny, and this is Ivanivkia. Of course, these maps show different, but for what we want to be looking at here is this. Since the last 2 weeks in December, Russian army crossed the Zedebets River and tried to consolidate in the western shore of the river north of Ivanivkia. The complete capture of the settlement will allow Russian forces to open a new axis towards this area, thus unblock the Torsky axis, which has been a hard nut to crack in the face of a tenacious resistance of the Ukrainian army. Only after Torsky will it be possible to speak of a breakthrough through to Liman. Of course, areas of which Russia did occupy at one point and had been pushed back out of. But that they have crossed the Zedebets, now the grey zone on this, that's enough for me to say there definitely was advancement there. Noel reports showing this, and as well Syriac showing that the Russians have got some level of foothold on the other side. Where will this move? Can they open another front line? If Russia can successfully open another front line, that is just going to mean that things are going to get worse and worse on the front for Ukraine, as what I've been speaking about is Russia is following this doctrine that Russian forces developed back in the First World War, Brusilov Offensive, I believe, where you just push on so many sectors at once, then you overwhelm, but not at one area, not everything at one area, because, of course, then your adversary can push on that and bring their resources to push back against this. And this is something you are offered in an attritional war if you are the numerically superior force. Again, I don't want to beat on a dead horse as I do. This is why Kursk, to me, makes no sense. And now that the gas is switched off with the gas exchange there, makes even less sense. But maybe I'll be proven wrong. It's either going to be the biggest military failure of this war or the biggest military success if we've missed something in here and it is and it turns into a success. Now, Vovchansk, this is an area we haven't spoken about because there's small movements in here, but not enough ever for the maps to really show it. There's just localized fighting. Of course, this is where Russia had their own sort of Kursk Mark 1 over a crossing in here that made initially a lot of ground and then stalled out. So we see, of course, Vovchansk, we've seen everything from TOS, from Fab 3000s, everything brought in here. And let's just look at the sheer destruction of Vovchansk. There is just nothing left. Now, someone did say that up in the top right was that video, remember, of the Russian Spetsnaz? We pointed that these guys must be SF because he was wearing a Crye Precision airframe helmet, a very expensive helmet, as well as the improved fitness and gear we had seen. Someone said this is actually the building up here, just the sheer destruction of this. And this is something that we have been speaking about that is something we need to take into account on our analysis, is when we saw Bakhmut, Avdiivka, it was looking like this, just nothing left, catastrophic. But what we have spoken about down at the moment in the Donbass is some of the areas taken over. Of course, there's a significant amount of destruction, but it's sure as shit not looking like that. So what I want to show you is this is Seledov, and this is probably the biggest one we spoke about. This is, of course, Russian forces here by Russian state media taking down the Ukrainian flag, hoisting up the Russian flag, but we're not interested in this. This was months ago. I want to look at the sheer destruction. Of course, there's a lot of damage here, but it's not what we had expected. And what this tells us is the rate of advancement was increased, the resistance was less, so it wasn't just this scorched earth tactic of what we have seen in somewhere like Vovchansk, of course, going both ways with the amount of shelling. And that isn't a good sign for what we may see in an area like Pokrovsk. And of course, while we're in this, Kurakhove, an area which has just come under then occupation, we see photographs like this. This was released today of a Russian sniper working this area. Now, again, I was trying to find a better image of this, but you can see that there's a shitload of damage here. I'm not trying to talk that down, but you can see as there has been increased advancement, one thing we get of this is actually less destruction, and that gives us an idea that actually the rate of advance is going quicker than it was as far as this just absolutely protracted, just treating everything as it goes, and that isn't a good sign because it can point towards the armed resistance in these areas too. Now, I just missed one update on this map. There's just a small update in the center of Toretsk. Now, what we do know is that Syriac maps shows the Russian forces are actually right out sort of in this sector here. Again, wait out on that. Things will become clearer and clearer, I'm sure. Well, they will have to become clearer eventually for what exactly is the position on the front line, especially if there is some negotiated settlement. None of the maps are going to be able to hide where the front line actually is. If it stops, like if it's like, yep, this is the new border, no map will be able to hide it. That will be very, very interesting to see what maps are wrong, what maps are overestimating, and what maps are underestimating. That will be very, very interesting. Now, Secretary of State Antony Blinken. We have to go through this because this is just wild. I just couldn't really believe it. And we can speak about the negative effect that the US's position with Israeli strikes in Gaza, in Lebanon, wherever, we can see how this has had such a negative impact on the informational space for Ukraine when, of course, asking the world to condemn Russian missile attacks, as the way the US react to these, or the West, the US and NATO and whatever react to these strikes is significantly different to the way they react to strikes in somewhere like Gaza. Now, I know there is an extreme amount of nuance that we can add to this, from the actions and legitimacy of Hamas through to the density of population. But again, many, many people, and I'm just saying this as an observer, many people are just seeing this as pure hypocrisy, and has led to many people not condemning these attacks. If you go to an Instagram page, look at some like sort of mainstream media when they share footage of, say, a Russian missile hitting Kyiv, and a lot of the top comments will be something like, well, Palestinians are living through this daily and no one condemns it, with thousands of likes. And that tells me everything I think we need to know about how people around the world are seeing the hypocrisy here. And this is included in some of the hypocrisy about upholding the IHL, international humanitarian law, laws of armed conflict, and Zelensky's favourite word, of course, the UN Charter. That people will see this and go, well, the US says one way for accountability and not the other. And I think this is very dangerous for the US because, as we see over the past decade and the decade to come, a reduction in US hegemony, which is happening because of the rise of the second world, the rise of the global south. I think the US is in a tough spot and is actually going into a more and more tough spot and needs to make some hard decisions around domestic power and international power outwards as well. But we need to go through this because there is some parts in this which I am just astounded by the tone deafness of, if that makes sense, from a highly intelligent person. So, interview. Antony Blinken insists he and Biden made the right calls. Sure. Okay, 4 years ago, after the tumultuous first Trump administration, President Biden came into office promising to rebuild old alliances and defend democracy. The man tasked with doing that on the world stage was Secretary of State Antony Blinken, a long-time diplomat who worked with Biden for 2 decades. Instead, Blinken was beset by an escalating series of international crisis almost from the beginning. The self-imposed wounds from the disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal were quickly followed by the generational challenge of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Hamas's savage attack on Israel, and Israel's subsequent scorched earth war in Gaza plunged the region into crisis and destabilized the political climate in America and worldwide as well. But remember here, this part about defending democracy and upholding international order, and then the law, the rules-based order that holds this all together. Of course, America wanting this rules-based order. All the while, Blinken continued to champion Biden's original vision of robust American diplomacy to solve the world's many problems. But the United States got involved in other ways, sending billions of dollars and weapons to both Israel and Ukraine, which caused a political fallout at home and also caused political fallout internationally as well. A new Trump administration is set to retreat from these very alliances and institutions that made Blinken sought to reinforce. Of course, this is one of the reasons why so many people ended up voting for President-elect Donald Trump, is because people said, you're not looking inwardly, you are only looking outwardly, and nothing is getting done for us. On January the 2nd, I sat down with Blinken at the State Department for a wide-ranging conversation about the world he is leaving behind, which, despite it all, he argues is better than the world of 4 years ago. And I'm sorry, but that is a ridiculous statement to try and imply the world now is better than 4 years ago. We have multiple wars. We are on the verge of then spilling across borders and potential nuclear war. So it's just ridiculous. Just don't ask the just American public. Don't ask Europeans, Ukrainians, Russians, Israelis, Palestinians. Again, I think that is ridiculous to say, regardless of the political climate within just US politics. But is the world now in a better space than 4 years ago? Just look at the wars. We don't even need to look at world economies as well. 4 years ago, you inherited the world from President Trump, and you're about to hand it back to him. Have you thought about what a strange position that is to be in? And this is his answer. We'll go through some of the important bits in this. If you look back just 4 years, when we took office, we inherited arguably the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Arguably, it's worse now. We inherited the worst public health crisis in at least 100 years. And what have you done about this? But we had a country that was divided. I think it's probably more divided now, or at least maybe it's more together, but against you, and we had fraught relationships with allies and partners around the world, and a perception from our adversaries, whether it was Russia, whether it was China, or other countries, that the United States was in an inexorable decline. Now, I think more people are thinking this more than ever, more than 4 years ago. Today, I sit with you. I think we hand over in America in a much, much stronger position, having come through an economic crisis, having come through the health crisis, and having changed much for the better our position around the world. In my opinion, and researching this and looking at this every day, America is in a far worse position right now than it was 4 years ago. Of course, 4 years ago, we had the odd spicy flu going around, but we knew that was always going to be temporary. So you can't base everything just off that. But as far as we're closer to having a world war, a nuclear war, we are in a Cold War, there are multiple out-of-control wars around the world, some of which we may lose. I don't see how you can put that together, mate. When you first came into office, President Biden painted a portrait of a world that was seeing a battle between democracy and autocracy, a phase that was repeatedly used. Yet at home, voters have been skeptical of that fight. Many voters bought into President-elect Trump's vision of an America that should be less involved in the world. Why don't you think that Biden administration, and you in particular, were able to convince voters of the benefit of what you have been endeavouring to do these past years? And I guess the question should be, and has it worked? Have you been able to do this? And this is exactly as we stated above, was many people feel like this administration put Americans last. Are Americans better off on average than they were 4 years ago or 4 years before that? Are Americans better off? Instead, has it just been looking outwardly the entire time? I'm not sure that I agree with the premise of the question. From what I see, from what I read, from the analysis that I see, most Americans want us to be engaged in the world. They want to make sure that we stay out of wars, that we avoid conflict, which is exactly what we've done. What the fuck are you on about, mate? You're literally involved now in multiple wars. The economy is shite, and America's global hegemony is in free fall, worse than it was, I believe, 4 years ago, but worse than it was even a decade ago. But this idea is exactly what we have done. You have not looked inwardly, which is reflected by the voting, and staying out of wars. Well, you absolutely fucked up the withdrawal out of Afghanistan, and now we have wars in multiple sectors around the world. If we're not lucky, it'll be in every sector. So you don't believe that the election was a repudiation of the vision of President Biden and your vision, because President-elect Trump has a very different idea of how to engage in the world, and won by a landslide. One of the things I do in this job, I've appreciated, is I don't do politics, I do policy. So the real reason is, what are the policies that can make a difference in the lives of Americans, can make them a little bit safer, a little bit more full of opportunity, and a little bit healthier. Yes, walking into a war with Russia, with Iran, adding fuel to fires with nuclear powers is not making Americans more safe, nor is it making Americans more rich or healthy. I don't think this administration has done any of this. Now, I'm not saying the next one will be successful at this, but people wanted change, and that is reflected through the voting. And of course, I just don't agree with what has actually happened here. I don't know what analysis people are looking at to get this. I'm not asking you to do politics. I'm just asking for a little reflection on, is this something you've given your life to? Obviously, their results were a disappointment. And so I wonder if that doesn't cause you to pause and reflect, that perhaps the animating vision that you have had might not have been what Americans wanted. I mean, do you think there's just a changing sense in this country of our place in the world and what we owe our allies? Yes, I can tell you that. A lot of people go, why are we continually looking outwardly while things are getting worse at home rather than looking inwardly? That there's more support for other areas in the world rather than our own homeless or our own veterans or X, Y, or Z in maybe a natural disaster. He says Americans don't want us in conflict. They don't want us in war, and that people are tired of war. As President Biden ended the longest war in our history, of course, Afghanistan, not ended he made it that we lost the war in Afghanistan. Now, could have anyone then won that? No, we lost the ability to win it in the first few years of an over 20-year campaign. But one of the things we try and explain to Americans, the reason so many of the institutions, including NATO, came into being in the first place was to try and make sure that we never had another global conflagration after World War II. Now, yes, NATO was there because of the Cold War and the rise of the power of the Soviet Union. But the reason for the US in NATO needs the US for firepower. The US does not need NATO for firepower. The US needs NATO because otherwise it is basically an isolated island in North America. It needs it for an arm into Europe and Asia. Otherwise, the US is isolated, like we said. So America needs that for influence. Otherwise, these European powers, some of these could end up, or could have been in the past, just absorbed further into then Asia as well. But has this stopped a third world war? Well, maybe. And he goes to this: an attack on one is an attack on all. That is the single most powerful way to prevent conflict in the first place, to deter aggression. And I guess so far it has worked. Although this idea, this Article 5 attack on one is an attack on all, this has never truly been tested. Now, if this is a measure of success, to say it hasn't been tested, therefore it works, that is, I guess, a measure of success. But to me, it is not beyond reasonable doubt to question the commitment to Article 5 in a massive crisis or a nuclear crisis. And I know a lot of people question if a bomb dropped in a Baltic state, in a NATO state, in Europe somewhere, what would America's response actually be to this? Not what the policy says, what the actions actually would be. And it hasn't been tested yet. So far, if it hasn't been tested, then it's succeeding. But if and when it is tested, how will that look? I don't know. But I wouldn't put all my chips in that it would be as the policy actually writes. I want to pick up on something you said there, which is discussing Afghanistan, because this takes us back to the beginning of your tenure. I think it's reasonable to argue that America's skepticism of the Biden administration's handling on foreign policy really began with the catastrophic way we got out of Afghanistan. There was consensus that we should absolutely end that war, but a manner in which it is done was very detrimental. How did that early failure in Afghanistan change the sense that President Biden really had this under control and that you had it under control? Did it damage America's credibility? And this interviewer I really like. First, I make no apologies for ending America's longest war. Well, you should apologise to the veterans and those families that lost people over there in America, that in a war that America and the coalition ended up losing for nothing in the end, rather than trillions of dollars going towards CEOs somewhere. Thus, I think a signal achievement of the president's. The fact that we will not have another generation of Americans fighting and dying in Afghanistan, that's an important achievement in of itself. It's also actually strengthened our position around the world. And I see that every single day our adversaries would like nothing more than for us to have remained bogged down in Afghanistan for another decade. The amount of military resource of the American forces that actually took part in Afghanistan was very, very little. So to say the Americans were bogged down in Afghanistan is incorrect. But like I said, what about these generation of soldiers who actually did go to Afghanistan, who were wounded and killed in action? For what? This, in my opinion, did not improve the US position in any way. To many, it showed the US could not win a war with an insurgency group. The same insurgency groups, with its humble beginnings, actually started a lot of it by the US itself. It also showed the failure of the US's rules-based order of their world order, that some countries don't want that. If Afghanistan wanted it, people who we trained, fought, spent $1 trillion would have fought back against it, and obviously saying that it showed that not every country wants this. It also shows the US security and its security guarantees for things can be limited and at best come with conditions. But you left a country in the control of the Taliban, where the stated dream of spreading democracy has been completely upended. Women have borne the brunt of that, although no feminists will talk about this, that Afghani women can't even look at their window. There are restrictions on their movements, restrictions on their voices, what jobs they can take in every possible way. The manner in which this has been done and the state of which Afghanistan has been left could not have been what the United States had desired. And you also left the Taliban more armed and trained than before, because a lot of the guys we trained defected across to save their and their families' lives. There was never going to be an easy way to extricate ourselves from 20 years of war. We also had to learn lessons from Afghanistan itself. I ordered immediately an after-action review to try and make sure that we understood what did we get right and also what did we get wrong about the withdrawal. And I'll say you got everything wrong about that. And the lessons learnt is, well, it was a complete fuck-up failure and we will be back there, I'm sure, at some point. Yes, of course, you learn things about insurgency, counterinsurgency, but to say that then the US or the West was in a better position out of that and that countries then looked at it with more respect because of that, you're fucking kidding yourself, mate. You're sucking on the end of a glass Barbie. 6 months after Afghanistan, Russia invaded Ukraine. That was February 22. I remember the moment as being terrifying. How close were we to direct conflict? Look, there have been different moments where we've had real concerns about actions that Russia might take, including even potentially the use of nuclear weapons. But I think throughout, we've been able to navigate this in a way that kept us away from direct conflict with Russia. America is in conflict with Russia, maybe not direct, but you can't say that it is not. If you're saying that North Korea and China are involved on the Russian side, well, then we are just as involved, if not a shitload more. We're supplying a hell of a lot more aid to Ukraine than China is to Russia. Now, Russia engaged in all sorts of nefarious activities, so-called hybrid attacks of one kind or another, whether it's in cyberspace, whether it's acts of sabotage or assassination. Those things are terrifying. They're happening in Europe, and a lot of this is happening all around from many, many powers. But in terms of direct conflict, I don't think we've been close. But it's something that we've had to be very, very mindful of. I think other people on the other side of the spectrum may say, no, we have been in direct conflict, or that we are much closer than you think. You made two early strategic decisions on Ukraine. The first, because of the fear of direct conflict, was to restrict Ukraine's use of American weapons within Russia. The second was to support Ukraine's military offensive without a parallel diplomatic track to try and end the conflict. How do you look back on those decisions now? So first, if you look at the trajectory of the conflict, because we saw it coming, we were able to make sure that not only were we prepared and the allies and partners were prepared, but that Ukraine was prepared. But what I see in this is I don't think that much was done to actually try and prevent this, at least to the nth degree of not having then a large war. But also what we see was allies and partners weren't prepared. We literally, in a lot of Western states, have legitimately run out of shells in both what can be used and in storage too, buying shells back of other nations or looking for other older shells. So to say that it was fully prepared for this is incorrect. I think they may have been prepared for there to be resistance, but not to the degree that we have seen. We made sure that well before the Russian aggression happened, starting in September and then again December, we quietly got a lot of weapons to Ukraine to make sure they had in hand what they needed to defend themselves, like stingers, jabs, and that were instrumental in preventing Russia from taking Kyiv. Now, firstly, I thought everyone knew this. I thought everyone knew that the US was supplying a shitload of arms to Ukraine before this war. But there is an argument here to be said for both defence, but there's also an argument here to say for, well, was there some provocation in this as well? But I think what's so important to understand is that at different points in time, people get focused on one weapon system or another, Abrams, F-16s. What we've had to look at each and every time is not only should we give this to Ukrainians, but do they know how to use it? And can they maintain it? A lot of this is forgotten in some of the systems that are requested that you're like, yeah, but who's looking after it and who is using it? In terms of diplomacy, we've exerted extraordinary diplomacy in bringing and keeping together more than 50 countries. But more countries than this have rejected US politics over Israel's actions. Of course, US tying themselves there, I think, long-term, people are going to go, a lot of countries are moving away because of that actions and not condemning things there. Even if you can condemn actions on every side of this, not only in Europe, but well beyond. In support of Ukraine in defense of these principles that Russia also attacked back in February of that year. Sergei Lavrov in Geneva a couple of months before the war was trying to find a way to see if we could prevent it. So talking with Minister of Foreign Affairs to see if they could prevent it. Trying to test the proposition where this was really about Russia's concerns for its security or somehow about Ukraine and the threat that it posed, or NATO and the threat that it posed, or whether this is about in fact, it is about, which Putin's imperial ambitions and the desire to recreate a greater Russia, to subsume Ukraine back into Russia. But we had to test that proposition. And we were intensely engaged diplomatically with Russia. Since then, had there been any opportunity to engage diplomatically in a way that could end the war on just and durable terms, we would have been the first to seize them. Unfortunately, at least until this moment, we haven't seen any signs that Russia has been genuinely prepared to engage. I hope that changes. There has been preparation to engage, but not on what you see as just an endurable terms. But he says here about Putin's imperial ambitions. If this was about just increasing kilometre squares for Russia, there would have been far easier fronts to push on in other nations. Putin's Constant has been about NATO growing and Ukraine's desire to join NATO and NATO's desire to have Ukraine. And much of this is in response to Russia's actions of why NATO is seeking to expand, or why Ukraine wants to come in. I can see a lot of that is in response to Russia's actions. But you cannot deny that NATO has had in its interest to grow as well and put itself geographically in a more tactical and strategic position. What I'll say to this, it's not up to NATO or the US to decide for Putin or for Russia what is and isn't a security concern. Neither is it Russia's place to say what is a consideration for other security concerns as well, say for Ukraine or for NATO. But at the end of the day, a security concern that is concerning that leader or that nation. And when it is a nuclear power, you have to take that very seriously. Even if you think that is a bullshit concern or not, you have to take it very seriously, because I do think that this whole war could have been avoided 20 years ago, decades ago, if correct actions by both Russian and Western diplomats were put in place. But in this as well, that there has not been a moment, I guess, to have diplomatic actions. I ask, what the fuck are you on about? Look at Ankara in Turkey. Now, I don't believe Russia has given terms that the US can accept, especially with the now hundreds of billions of aid given, that the more aid has been given, the more has been pushed into here. The threshold for what the US will be willing to accept has grown and grown and grown. But has there been willingness to have some end of this? Absolutely. Now, let's continue on this. Ukraine has been left in a position now where there's a new administration coming in, and they have had a very different view of the conflict. And one could argue that Ukraine is not in a terribly strong position to be able to navigate what comes next. Trump has people around him who have say being willing to have Ukraine cede territory. There has been no parallel diplomatic track. So yeah, this is the thing, is it's like, okay, if this comes to it, what else is being done in the back end? And the weapons are probably going to be drying up. Do you feel you've left Ukraine in the strongest possible position that you could have, or were things that you could have done differently? Well, first, what we've left is Ukraine, which was not self-evident because Putin's ambition was to erase it from the map. We stopped that. Putin has failed. Ukraine is standing. And I believe it is also has extraordinary potential, not only to survive, but to thrive going forward. And that does depend on decisions that the future administration and many other countries will make. And it also depends, mate, on the decisions that you made years ago. But if Ukraine does not join NATO, if it's left devastated and can't join by some way, either by diplomatic actions or by military actions, I see that as Putin would tick the box and say that was a success, because that is the singular constant here. Do you think it's time to end the war? He says these are decisions for Ukrainians to make. Well, let them decide. What if you're so much in slide number 1 and 2, we look for upholding democracy and against autocracy. Well, let Ukrainians make that decision. Currently under martial law hits the suspend button on democracy for autocratic leadership, so you can have a more vertical structure, so decisions are more efficient. But at the end of the day, let them then decide, not one or two people or one person in leadership position. They have to decide where their future is. Let them. And how they want to get there. Let them. Where the line is drawn on the map at this point. I don't think is fundamentally going to change very much. So he's saying the line on the map, he does not believe is going to change very much. My point is, I don't think if that's not going to change very much, if you truly believe this, then look for other ways, because now all you're doing there is feeding men from both sides into a line that is not going to change. And that is just as much for the Russian leadership doing this as well. But we do see that Russia has gained over 3,000 square kilometres in the past year. Is that massive? No. Is it growing month by month? Well, yes, until winter kicked in. Will we see that next year? Well, we're going to find out. You mean the areas that Russia controls you feel will have to be ceded? Ceded is not the question. The question is in line as a practical matter in the foreseeable future. Is unlikely to move very much. Ukraine's claim on that territory will always be there. This is the thing. I don't believe Putin will agree to a ceasefire without taking that land officially, with Ukraine not in NATO, or unless he is defeated. I believe that's the thing. He'll only stop if defeated. There is no Ukraine in NATO and taking that land. Again, I think people need to look up negotiating, especially from a position of weakness at the moment, which Ukraine will be negotiating from and its allies will be negotiating from. There's going to have to be a carrot or stick. The stick is failing. The carrot's going to have to be very large. And I don't think the US administration is ready to have that, because it will be seen worldwide, like Afghanistan, as a failure. The question is, will they find ways with the support of others to regain territory that it's lost? It's unlikely that Putin will give up his ambitions. If there's a ceasefire, then in Putin's mind, the ceasefire is likely to give him time to rest, refit, and re-attack at some point in the future. But he will be looking over the border thinking the exact same thing. So what's going to be critical to make sure that any ceasefire that comes about is actually enduring, and is to make sure Ukraine has the capacity going forward to deter further aggression, and that it can come in many forms. It could come through NATO, and we put Ukraine on the path to NATO membership. It could come through security assurances, commitments, guarantees by different countries to make sure that Russia knows that if it attacks, it's going to have a big problem. So how do you think, though, then that territory is ever going to get returned? Because I don't think Putin's ready to diplomatically return that, because of the cost he is warned to do that would have to be done militarily. But on the other side of this coin, you're saying that it's always going to be Ukrainian land no matter what gets signed, and that Ukraine will be in NATO. So if this is it, that, yep, this is going to be Ukrainian land and Ukraine's going to be in NATO, then what is going to stop Putin from believing, though, that NATO was going to have a military attack to try and take that back at some point? This is what, if you want to be an analyst for strategy, you have to be able to look at it from how others may see it, even if you disagree with that. I agree that NATO is a defensive alliance in Europe. Externally from that, look at Turkey's actions, no. But in Europe, it is defensive. But you need to be able to look on the other side and going, well, if you're saying Putin's going to take an opportunity for a ceasefire to refit and refight and whatever, what do you think is going to be happening on the other side here as well? What I'm hearing you say is that Ukraine's fate will no longer rest in its major supporter, the United States. You see this as resting somewhere else in Europe. Look, I hope very much, and I don't want to say expect, but I certainly hope very much the United States will remain the vital supporter that it's been for Ukraine. Once again, it's not about Ukraine. It's never been just about Ukraine. Okay, this is one of the conflicts that will be handed back to Trump. His approach to foreign policy, writ large, seems to be to avoid engaging militarily while wanting the world to be scared of us. He doesn't seem terribly interested in the work of diplomacy. I'm curious how you would define that foreign policy philosophy, and what would you think of that approach? I think he's far more interested in actually diplomacy rather than fighting wars. But to me, as I said before, in the absence of American diplomacy, you're going to have diplomacy by lots of other countries that are going to shape the world in ways that may not be so friendly to our own interests and our own values. But the world is better now, and Afghanistan was a success. Many countries have taken advantage of the loss there. So that's the choice. We can disengage, we cannot be present. We can stand back, but no, others will step in. And we have to decide whether that's in our interest. And I think a lot of Americans have the opinion of, it's not our problem. Let them. And if they want to attack us directly, we'll smoke them. But until that point, it's not our issue. We need to look internally rather than externally. As an observer of what is happening there, that is the way I see people. People going, we're sick of America spending all of the money that we make on putting our world order around the world, while things at home are getting worse and worse. Legends, let's go through these next slides tomorrow because this video is just getting way too long and I'm really running out of time. But look after yourselves, and we'll go through the rest of this because it just shows, I think, why this administration was such a failure, and what they're handing over, I think, objectively is a much more volatile world than what was handed, and I think by basically every measure. Look, we'll go through this tomorrow. Legends, look after yourself and I'll speak to them. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.